Welcome back, everyone, to Creator in Conversation. Now, this is a special episode because we're pivoting away slightly from comics towards pulps. The pulp stories of old, like The Shadow, Doc Savage. These are where some of the origins of the characters we know today came from. They inspired a generation of comic book readers. Like the Spider existed long before Stan Lee had the idea of Spider-Man. Doc Savage was known as the Man of Bronze, whereas Superman was the Man of Steel. Doc Savage's first name was Clark, where Clark Kent is, of course, Superman, and both had, but Doc Savage had a Fortress of Solitude up in the North Pole. So Will Murray has been writing some new adventures featuring these characters. I had the opportunity 2 years back to interview Will as part of the 10th anniversary of Dublin Comic Con. So what you're about to hear is this pre-recorded interview I did with Will. What was really exciting is that Will Murray actually got to collaborate with the Spider-Man co-creator Steve Ditko, and he was able to co-create with Steve Squirrel Girl. So I was able to talk a little bit with Will about what it was like working with the legendary Steve Ditko. So for that alone, I was delighted. But also, I was a huge fan of the Doc Savage Shadow novel crossover that Will Murray wrote himself. So this is a really engaging, really interesting conversation. I hope you enjoy it, and if you can pop over to Pulse Comics on YouTube as well as our YouTube channel. But if you go to Pulse Comics, you'll see the actual video for this interview, which was recorded again in association with the Pulse College Room at Dublin Comic Con for the 10th anniversary of DCC. So sit back and enjoy. Welcome very much to William Patrick Murray to Dublin Comic Con. We were just discussing your Irish roots just before the recording. You were saying your mother's from County Kerry.
Yeah, and my father's people are from, I think, Cork and Galway. And they were Bransfields, and there were two famous Bransfields. Edward Bransfield was a impressed sailor with the British Navy who discovered a hunk of Antarctica before they knew what it was. And there's a memorial for him in his hometown. And we had another Bransfield who came to the U.S. and was an Indian scout during the Civil War, who went back to Ireland on his pension. So that's the two famous Bransfields. I'm the only famous Murray to my knowledge, but my knowledge doesn't go that deep.
That's amazing. And have you ever made it over to Ireland yourself? Have you ever come?
No, I never have. I just never had the opportunity. I've been to England, which is close, but not Ireland, obviously. So no, I haven't.
We'll forgive you for going to England before you came to see us. That's okay. But hopefully, who knows? Hopefully, in the future, we get you over here in person as well at the show. Now, listen, I'm really excited for this particular talk, and you were so good in. I reached out to you online, and you're so prolific, particularly on Facebook, with the recent work that you've been doing. I say recent, but you've been at it a while with regards to Doc Savage, The Shadow, Tarzan, Sherlock Holmes, King Kong. The Wild Adventure series is, am I correct, is the umbrella that many of them come under. And for me, it's been great because I'm a huge comic book fan. Often reading, of course, Superman, and Superman would be known around the globe. But then what folks don't realize is, well, the Man of Steel, as he's known, was heavily inspired by the Man of Bronze, Doc Savage. In fact, it's Clark Savage, and it's his fortress. He had his fortress first up in the North Pole. So it's just been amazing for me to go back, and then through your stories, you've been telling new stories, but it's still contemporaneous to the time of the original tales as well. So how did this come about for you, that you were able to work on projects like these, and how's it been for you so far working on them?
Well, it started a long time ago when I made contact with Lester Dent's widow, Norma Dent, who was Lester Dent was the main writer on Doc Savage. And I visited her home in Missouri and went through his papers, and I discovered a Doc Savage outline that was never used. And it, over time, crossed my mind that someone should write it, and maybe it should be me, because I knew so much about Doc. So with her permission, I wrote a draft. I sent it to Bantam Books, which was then publishing Doc, and they were very interested, but they wanted to finish reprinting the original stories. So 11 years later, they published it. That was Python Isle, and they wanted 2 more. And I had that material that could be adapted for 2 more. And then we did 7 of them in those days. And then the industry kind of changed in terms of what kind of books the publishers wanted. But I never gave up reviving it. So in 2010, I got the rights to Doc Savage, and we picked up where we left off. And there was a lot of Lester Dent material that could be adapted. He left unfinished manuscripts, outlines, etc. And so I was happily doing Doc Savage until a few years ago when they decided they wanted a modern Doc Savage, and James Patterson and a collaborator doing modern Doc Savages. That's a long answer to a short question, but there we are.
No, that's what we're here for. It's all gold, and it's interesting. You touched upon the James Patterson stories as well, because I checked out his Shadow. I think the Shadow. I don't know. Is the Doc Savage one out for Patterson? I don't think so, but I know I checked out the Shadow, and that was a big departure from. It
was a huge departure.
Yeah, I was kind of shocked.
Is out. I haven't read it, but it is out.
Okay. That see, I'm not. It's such a peculiar case study, that one, because it's not only a departure from what you would expect from the stories, but it's also, as I said, like I'm into Doc Savage and the Shadow, and I'm not even aware that it's out already. That's kind of crazy as well. So one has to wonder what way is it are they marketing it as well. And what was great with the material that you were writing as well, because you of course have a comic book background as well. And Diamond, we have comic book shops here in Dublin, in particular local store Dublin City Comics. So I became acquainted with the Doc Savage series through Diamond, the Diamond catalog, which has been great. And I know in the States now, it's kind of the Diamond kind of distribution's broken up more. So it used to be that they serviced everyone, but they still serve Ireland and the UK, because when they went to Luna and everyone else in the States, they forgot they haven't got a warehouse to serve Europe. So we still have Diamond basically, which has been great for the stores here. Now, with regard, so a lot of the material you're doing, you said you came across some Lester Dent material, and you were able to, expand and then originate new material as well from that. But you also are able to make possible, like the type of stories that fans could only dream of, like the actual big team up of the Shadow and Doc Savage. And I actually got around to those stories, like many people during lockdown, finally found, the time to catch up with my reading. And what was amazing is the continuity particularly in the Shadow, because the Shadow as a character is fascinating as a history, because, correct me if I'm wrong, because I could get this wrong, but he didn't originate in the pubs. He originated as a character for radio, and then his popularity led to him going into the pub.
He originated as a narrator on radio, a kind of master of ceremonies on the sinister side. He did not become a character in terms of a personality with an alternate identity until the Pulp magazine, which was 1931, only maybe 6 months or so after the radio show started.
Yeah, and that's what's really interesting about his origins, that being that kind of for want of a better phrase, convoluted from how he emerged into the pulps, was the stories were diverged then, because it's Walter Gibson who would have been the main writer on The Shadow, or one of the most prolific. And what's great is, particularly if you buy the republished material now, you'll find essays about the craze about Gibson. He had phenomenal records when it comes towards like typewriting. Like he must have had like the world record or something, I think it was, when it came to typing. He just It's incredible. But what we ended up with The Shadow then was a kind of divergent paths from his story and background, which would be the interpretation, perhaps the face was, disfigured or hidden or makeup. And I found in the Doc Savage Shadow crossover, the Force and the Sinister Shadow, you did such a wonderful job in giving harmony to that continuity as well. And I say this to everyone, if they've never read the originals, I found this to be a great starting point as well for them, because because you do so well in like not introducing, but you kind of, I suppose, the contradictions that appear later you kind of have to give some harmony to that as well. Was that just an itch that you had to kind of scratch yourself as a fan to try and give cohesion to it?
Yeah, because I don't think writing another Doc Savage novel or another Shadow novel or even a crossover is necessarily worth the effort unless you can do more with it. And part of doing more with it is to explore both characters. I have a philosophy that I've evolved that when you do a crossover like this, you first have to decide whose world is the story taking place in. And in my first crossover with those two characters, the Sinister Shadow, I decided it was taking place in the Shadows world, the world where there's a seedy underworld. The villain is scaled to the Shadow size and not Doc Savage's concept of a villain. And the events are localized to greater New York. And I wrote Doc a little differently than I would normally do. I wrote him, first of all, it takes place in the first year, more or less, of both these characters' careers, so they haven't quite developed. So I wrote Doc a little bit like through a Walter Gibson lens, where he's exactly who he's supposed to be, but he's seen, in not quite the grandiose terms he later became, not quite the superhero. And I found that worked, and I found that was interesting. There's an interesting backstory to this. In 1932, before Lester Dent wrote his first Doc Savages, he was given a Shadow novel to write. It's called The Golden Vulture, and he had to do it 2 or 3 times before Street and Smith was satisfied with the version he turned in. I discovered, just before I started writing this, there's a version I'd never seen that is so radically different. There were something like 22 chapters that did not appear in the final version of Golden Vulture that I could adapt into my story. So I built my story to some degree around that continuity. So in this sense, this book is Will Murray rewriting Lester Dent, who's trying to write like Walter Gibson. So you get the confluence of all 3 writers. It was a very unusual book to write. I love writing it. I think it's a masterpiece of not just trying to weave the disparate elements together, but to do some of the things that would appeal to fans, such as the face issue, which Walter Gibson admitted that was an idea early on, but they walked away from it. They decided we didn't want that. It was too gruesome. So I cleaned that up. And at the end, there's a character who's revealed to become another character. And that was another thing that was, cool about that story. So it was, again, trying to do something on a higher level than here's a slam bang team up between these 2 favorite characters.
Yeah, and I cannot recommend it enough, particularly. I remember when I went out to look up, because I was just curious. There was one particular summer, and I was just curious to learn more about like Doc Savage in particular. But when I went around to secondhand shops in particular, there wasn't much material, and then lo and behold, in the Diamond catalog, and then folks might sometimes feel, and I don't know, it depends on the audience and the reader, but sometimes folks feel a little off-put if something's set in a contemporary time, like a time off its time. But I find particularly, and maybe you might have noticed this, become more sensitive, being a period writer of sorts, that you have like Bridgerton on Netflix and, The Crown and other events that are set in a particular time period. Audience seem to resonate well with it. But one could argue perhaps they dilute little elements to make it more, contemporaneous to today. But for me, reading it, it was just, it was great. Like I didn't feel it had to give me a nod and a wink to present day stuff.
No, I don't do that.
Yeah, and that's it. And that's it. It's so authentic, but at the same time, it didn't feel like I didn't know what was happening, because Sherlock Holmes is you've written some Sherlock Holmes.
I've written 40-something Sherlock Holmes stories.
That's incredible. We have Sherlock in comics. I did for Comic Con years ago. We did a short Sherlock Holmes comic that we did for charity, and we had Mike Collins, who was the storyboard artist for the BBC Sherlock, do a pinup, and it was more just kind of like a greatest hits of pinups, really. But I found I was younger reading Sherlock Holmes. That was something which was sometimes tricky was Arthur Conan Doyle. Very much, if you didn't know what this was, he wasn't explaining it. It was just off the time. But Sherlock, how did you feel tackling Sherlock? Because I find initially when I went to do something with Sherlock, I thought about an original idea, because we had at that stage the Arthur Conan Doyle estate and whoever held the UK and Irish publishing rights, we had them on board at the time. Well, I remember feeling so intimidated that I just bolted and said, let's play it safe and just adapt pre-existing material as best we can with a very limited original story. What comes first for you with Sherlock? Is it, the mystery or the idea of the story, or is it like you just want to play in the sandbox with the characters?
Well, I think I always want to play in the sandbox with the characters, because since the sandbox is already constructed, it's a matter of adapting yourself to that. My Sherlock Holmes career started when an editor at Moonstone Books asked me to do a Sherlock Holmes story for a team-up book called The Crossover Case Book. And instead of using a fictitious character, I kind of cheated, and I used Colonel Richard Henry Savage, an American military man and lawyer and author who was a contemporary of Sherlock Holmes, who turned out to be the inspiration for Doc Savage and the Avenger, or partial inspiration. So I played with that, and a few years later, I was asked to do a story for an Australian anthology, Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Was Not, and the conceit of that anthology was Sherlock Holmes would be authentically Sherlock Holmes, and we would have a different Watson. We would create one or whatever. I cheated on that a little bit because Watson was part of the story, and I had him meet H.P. Lovecraft's Dr. Herbert West. And that would seem to have been the end of my Sherlock Holmes career, but David Markham of the MX Sherlock Holmes anthologies asked me to write a story, and I got finally a chance to write an authentic Sherlock Holmes without any crossovers. And then he asked me to write another, and somehow it's gotten out of control. I've done more than 40. So that's how that came about. I feel a little self-conscious as an American who doesn't have a particular interest in the Victorian era to write these things. But as I mentioned earlier, my mother's Irish. My mother was Irish. She's no longer with us. And I was around a kind of pattern of speech growing up that wasn't that far from Victorian English. At least that's how I see it. So I kind of see that influence as being significant here. And if Kareem Abdul-Jabbar can write a Sherlock Holmes story, I thought I could do one.
He has a great, it's Mycroft, and that was adapted into a comic as well. I think his Mycroft series, if I remember correctly, I think he did one, which is really interesting. His kind of a prequel series of sorts. And in terms of actually, just because I mentioned it as well, coming to comics as well, like you've had a very distinguished career in comics also. What's interesting is the character of Squirrel Girl. I have to confess, I'm an avid comic book reader, but Squirrel Girl was never much on my radar as a character. But I am aware in the periphery of sorts. What did strike out to me though was you co-created Squirrel Girl with Steve Ditko, and here in Pulse College, we actually name our labs after notable people in animation, games, sequential art, anime. So we actually have a lab called the Ditko Lab. So it'd be remiss of me if I didn't ask about your collaboration with Mr. Ditko. Like, were you in correspondence with him much if you did work with him, or was it more just sending off materials and notes back and forth?
Well, I was asked to do an Iron Man story for a fill-in issue. And at that time, I had already been working with Marvel on the Destroyer Black and White series. And that was based on the Destroyer paperback series, which I was ghostwriting at that time. So we had a lead story that might be 48 pages, and we had needed backup stories. And I requested some of my favorite childhood artists, Don Heck and Steve Ditko, who came through and do stories. So I was already in touch with Steve when the Squirrel Girl thing came up. Now, the interesting story about that is that I was supposed to partner with an artist named Tom Morgan on that particular Iron Man story. And Tom, was a big Iron Man fan and hadn't drawn the character in the story yet. So the story I heard many years later is that prior to Tom coming to the office to pick up the script, Tom DeFalco, who was editor-in-chief of Marvel Comics, told all his editors, look, Steve Ditko needs work. We owe him a lot for Spider-Man and Doctor Strange. If he comes in looking for work, give him something. It just so happened that Steve showed up in my editor, Howard Mackey's office, the day or the hour in which the script was on Howard's desk, and Tom Morgan was sitting there ready to receive it. And when Ditko walked in, Howard just handed him the Iron Man script, leaving poor Tom Morgan out on a limb. I'm sure they got him something else to draw. So that's how, Steve came into this. So I was already working with him. Excuse me just a second.
No problem. I'll take your time. Again, thank you. Thanks so much. I just had to point out for the recording that you're actually down with a cold today and you've taken time out to talk to us. So really appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Yeah, we're happy to do it. So, I talked to Steve about this. Now, he was very headstrong and he has his own view of things. In my script, which was a full script, despite the credits on the first story, which gave Ditko plotting credit, I had described Squirrel Girl as wearing forest green outfit, kind of like Robin Hood. Excuse me. Or a little bit, my influence was largely Mary Martin's Peter Pan, which I don't know that you guys saw that over in Ireland, but I grew up watching it as a special on TV. And when the art came back, the pencil art came back, she was in a completely different outfit. And I asked Steve about that. And he said, philosophically, a character should look like what they are. Spider-Man has webs. Iron Man should be metallic, things like that. So my thinking was Squirrel Girl would be up in the trees. So having a Robin Hood kind of outfit would be camouflage, but also appropriate for hanging around with squirrels in the forest. He thought she should have fur and she should look like, since she was 15 at the time, she should look, I assume, he didn't say this explicitly, but I assume he assumed a 15-year-old girl would throw together a costume out of whatever's around the household. I mean, she's wearing fur. I don't think she's wearing Squirrel Girl. She's probably wearing rabbit fur. It's what she could scrounge up. So he penciled it. We had a few discussions about a couple things. He improvised a couple things I didn't care for, but I went with it. And I was very happy, ultimately. I thought it was great working with him on a full-length story. And, of course, he's the guy who redesigned Iron Man in 1964. So I was thrilled to collaborate with him on an Iron Man story.
That's amazing. And for us, like for many of the fans, like Ditko, he's just like, he's one of the giants, isn't he? Like the pillars in which like what Marvel became today was built on. So that's like, it's such an amazing career that you've had, like from like key figures in literature like Sherlock Holmes to like the pulps which generated the genesis of so many of our heroes, like Batman, Superman's, all generated from like the Doc Savages and the Shadows. And of course, I'd be again remiss of me again if I didn't mention the giant ape in the room as well, where in your screen behind you there you have King Kong, so Doc versus Kong, and this isn't the only story you've created as well with King Kong. There's been a Tarzan crossover, if I'm correct.
Tarzan, King Kong versus Tarzan was our second King Kong crossover. And Skull Island, which is our Doc Savage King Kong crossover, was our first crossover. And I had no idea when we were doing it, I was going to start a career as the king of crossovers in terms of pulp fiction, but that's what happened. Because I've since done several crossover, including Tarzan and John Carter of Mars, of which the second book in that sequence has just come out. So, these are all dream projects, but more significantly, these were projects that nobody thought was possible from a rights standpoint or a permission standpoint. Marion C. Cooper, who created King Kong, fell in love with the idea of making a King Kong meets Tarzan movie in 1935. He couldn't get the rights to either character, and he thought he owned King Kong. So and Dark Horse, years and years later in the 90s, started putting together a King Kong Tarzan set on Skull Island graphic novel, but they couldn't untangle the rights. The key advantage I have is my cover artist, Joe DeVito, is tied in with the Marion C. Cooper family. Excuse me. And he was able to work the deal for us, and he had a connection to the Edgar Rice Burroughs people, and that led to King Kong versus Tarzan. And my connections with Condé Nast, who owned Doc Savage, enabled me to do the two Shadow meets Doc Savage. And later, I acquired the rights to the Spider and had him team up with G8 and Operator 5 and other characters from that particular publishing house. So it's pretty amazing in the sense that none of this was planned. My initial idea was to do maybe 8 Doc Savages, and that would be it. But it's turned into this little cottage industry of crossovers and related characters.
And I noticed you mentioned the Spider, which that was one of the rare occasions where I found it must have been an early 90s reprint of some of the Spider stories, but that's often was cited by Stan Lee as one of the inspirations for Spider-Man as well. It just even the name of the characters, Stan remembered growing up with the pulps, and I'm friends with Alex Saviuk, who worked with Roy Thomas and Stan on the Spider-Man daily strips, and that was interesting to hear Alex talk about the strips, is because they only existed, particularly with the rights at Marvel and everything, because Stan grew up. The newspaper strip was such an important aspect of, because there was like no color TV, colored entertainment was in the newspaper print itself. And I have a close affinity to the newspaper strip characters as well, because I published the Phantom, and often I go around, correcting people who would point out, Superman's the fourth superhero. I'm like, oh, hold on, 1936, the Phantom came out, but it's the comic strip. But what triggered it in my mind was when you mentioned the Spider. I think the Spider has the Phantom beat because he had the lighter, which would leave the mark of the Spider. And I think the Spider predates the Phantom as well. He does
about 3 years, yeah.
Yeah, it's like the snake that eats its own tail here. We go back and we find, like, it's all dominoes. They inspire each other as well, and they adapt over time. And have you noticed that with the evolution of the characters, each creator kind of brings their own, not a particular spin. It's still clear the DNA of the character is still there. But like taking the Shadow, we mentioned Walter Gibson, but he wasn't the sole writer on the Shadow as well. And the same for Doc Savage. There were multiple different writers. In comic books, we break them down into like the Golden Age, the Silver Age, Dark Age, Modern Age, etc. In pulps, do they go through that type of transition? Because I think there is a difference with Doc between 80 Doc and I think 1950s might have been. When's the last Doc Savage, like, of the original
1949.
One? 1949, okay. So I would have come into that then. Do like fans of the pulps and readers of the pulps, do they break it down into their own kind of a chronology? Do they have something that mirrors that of the comic book fandom?
Nobody does that, but the style from the early 30s to the late 30s did change, and the tone started changing radically around 1938, 39, 40, in terms of the fact that when, in part because you have to, adjust, the writing and the approach to the characters because the audience either changes or matures, and you have to be lockstep with them. Just about every pulp, Doc Savage, The Shadow, The Spider, around 1938-40, there's a shift in the tone. It's not that early 30s gritty writing style. There's a little more humor in some of them, even in The Shadow, but not in The Spider. But there's a tendency to humanize the characters, to have them be less, impossible Superman. And those that survived the post-war era, which were very few, they the stories matured quite a bit more and became a little more sophisticated. And so they walked away from their pulp roots. But there aren't ages as such. They're not divided that way by anyone. It's just we have to change with the times, and sometimes with the shadow. When the radio program in 1937 with Orson Welles introduced Margot Lane and the Thin Man kind of approach, Mr. and Mrs. North kind of approach to Lamont Cranston and Margot Lane solving mysteries, Walter Gibson became increasingly under pressure to write his stories more, at least parallel to the radio show, and to include Margot Lane. He wasn't happy, but he went along with it because he wanted the magazine to continue.
Yeah, and I just in terms of you mentioned humor as well. What's been fascinating for me is among younger readers discovering the pulp characters today. Recently, many are making memes of the characters, like humorous kind of extracts, but they do so, what I found is very endearing, with reverence to the characters as well, like real insider kind of jokes, like how the shadow would be mysterious to how the spider would go in, with the hunchback and the guns blazing. But then it seems to be making a resurgence among younger readers, which has been great to see, because we've seen in terms of comic books, there's been a shift towards in Western audiences reading more manga related content. It's like in terms you go into the bookstores now, you see that they have more Japanese based comic book material. But in terms of like short stories and literature, the pulp characters, there's something just kind of out there, and I think it's also an element of for so long they kind of became forbidden fruit for the older readers as well. I don't think the pulps, correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think the pulps got it as bad as or maybe they did when it came to the comic books in the 1950s. You have
not as bad in general, but some of them did get attacked. The Weird Menace pulps were basically put out of business in 1940 by various pressure groups. And, even the better pulps were sometimes lumped in with the less savory pulps. So yeah, there was a certain element of disapproval in certain quarters. There always is, no matter what you do. But I would say Street and Smith pulps had a very high standard, and some of the others did, and some of them had less high. The Spider, seemed to be aimed at a somewhat older audience, but also an audience that wanted was open to more violence and more suggestive material without being risque. So it was tougher. The Spider was there was a guy named Bob Sampson, a friend of mine who's passed on now, who wrote a book on the Spider, and he said in his neighborhood the tough kids all read the Spider.
So, it's true. The character they seem to come back. It's not that they even left, but it's just that they find, kind of like Batman as a character. I heard Frank Miller once describe him as like a diamond, which is you can have Lego Batman, or you could have grim, gritty Batman, Adam West Batman. It kind of, the character holds up. With the pulp characters, I've read and enjoyed different interpretations of the characters. Like they have been adapted in comic book forms and live action film and serials. With varying degrees of success, I suppose, in that regard. But there's something about the pulps where they kind of like the prose form seems to be like the best. There's something pristine about it. Do you have a personal preference when you engage with characters? Like, would you, if you were to say, script up a shadow comic as opposed to a prose story, would your approach to it be different, or would you just kind of break the story first?
Well, your approach has to be different because it's more visual, and you probably don't have as much space to tell a story. But my feeling is to always try to extract the essence of a character or a series or an individual novel. When I wrote the Destroyer comic book for Marvel Comics, some of my stories were adaptations, and many of them were originals. And what I would do with the adaptations is I would try to extract from the story liberally what needed to be on the page for it to be visual, to have page-to-page continuity, and to work as a coherent story. You can't literally adapt a lot of novels to comic form, no matter how many pages you have, because people today, for a long time, they want a graphic novel to be a little bit cinematic. So, you can't have a lot of talking heads, and you can't have a lot of background shots of things in the far distance. It has to be in the reader's face. So you have to be open to whatever it takes to turn this piece of prose to this graphic novel.
Yeah, that's amazing. That's fantastic. We're just coming to the time here for ourselves as well. I know future me, he's probably prepping the con room as well for the next panel. But before we wrap up here, if folks want to go out, find some of your work, read stories, like what would be the best place to go to order in?
Well, my trade paperbacks and ebooks are on Amazon, and most of them are under the name Will Murray, but a lot of them, the Doc Savages, are under the name Kenneth Robeson. I also have a webpage, www.adventuresinbronze.com, where everything, including my collector edition hardcovers, can be ordered. So www.adventuresinbronze.com. That's a good place to go to see all the covers of everything I have in print. And whether you order them from me or Amazon makes no difference, but that's where you can find everything in one place.
That's fantastic. I'll hopefully now future on, I'm going to put this underneath the video when it goes out online as well. So folks should look below and there should be the link. Will, thank you so much. Really appreciate you taking the time out here today to speak with us. And as I said, I'm a fan. I love it, and I look forward to reading more as well. So thank you so much. And,
well, thank you, Austin, and I'm glad to be a part of the Dublin Comic Con, something that, I would never imagine attending very easily because it's a long way. But this has been fun.
Awesome. Thanks so much. All the best now. Thank you. Thanks very much again, everyone, for joining us for this episode. Again, my thanks to Dublin Comic Con in particular, who has afforded me this opportunity in the past to interview so many guest speakers as well. In the coming episodes, I might cycle through some previous interviews as well, pull them out and represent them here for you, our new audience, with Creator in Conversation. We have a lot of new up-and-coming interviews at this time of recording as well. I'm delighted to share with you, including interviews with editors, which is going to be a really interesting approach, because so far in the creative process, we've seen those who, act out our favourite characters, write for our favourite characters, illustrate our favourite characters, but what about the people who help put all these different moving parts together into the product we consume and read and love and enjoy? So we're going to find more about that in coming episodes, so stay tuned. Again, if you can, we appreciate it if you could like, share and subscribe. And until next time, this has been a copyright production of Macaulay Consultancy 2025.